New York City is known as a city of immigrants. For hundreds of years, people have been coming to the city to start new lives, and against all obstacles and discrimination, their labor has made New York City one of the biggest and most dynamic cities in the world. And the Statue of Liberty in the harbor is a symbol of immigration in New York City, known throughout the world because so many immigrants passed it as they journeyed up into New York. But there's another monument to immigration in New York City that's less well known, that's absolutely vital to the city's future. And that's the New York City subway. Immigrants built the New York City subway, immigrants run the New York City subway today, and in the past and the present, they ride it into their future. The subway system knits the city of New York 5 boroughs into one functioning metropolis. It lets a person live in affordable housing in one part of the city and move quickly and easily, when the system is working, to a good-paying job in downtown Manhattan. It lets a young person go from a remote part of the city to a first-class research library in Midtown. And it lets a kid who's sweltering in Brooklyn in the middle of the summer get to the seaside at Coney Island. But right now, that system is endangered. It's been mismanaged, it's been underfunded, and it's not running the way it should. And that threatens the future of all New Yorkers. As usual, the story goes back a long way. More than 100 years ago, New York City was already a great city of immigrants. And in the 1880s and 1890s, a new generation of immigrants started coming to the city. Mostly Italian Americans, Jewish Americans from Russia, Poles, Greeks, people from Southern and Eastern Europe. They came to New York City looking for a better life. But when they got to New York, they had very few options as to where they could live. They crowded into the streets of Lower Manhattan on the Lower East Side. Reformers like Jacob Riis looked at their neighborhoods and wondered what would become of them, because New York City was one of the most densely populated places in all the world. There was a lot of space in New York City, but there was no housing for the immigrants that was at all useful or convenient to them because there was no way for them to get to the areas of the city, like the Bronx or Brooklyn or Queens, that were then rural, filled with estates and even farms. By the end of the 19th century, a plan emerged, the creation of a subway system to be called the Interborough Rapid Transit that would take people from Lower Manhattan up through the length of Manhattan into the Bronx. Construction on that system started in the early 20th century, and as we'd see again and again in New York, it's immigrants who played a pivotal role in getting things done. Many of the workers on the first subway projects were Italian immigrants. They came to New York City with skills with pick and shovel from working as agricultural laborers in Italy, and they went to work excavating on the Mammoth Project. They did big, deep excavations in the middle of the city, but also tile work that you can still see in the subway platforms of New York City. The mosaics they did blended work and art and skilled craftsmanship, and they are a sign that the New York City subway, as always, is a meeting of the past and the present. When the IRT opened in 1904, it heralded a new life for people who are living in crowded parts of Lower Manhattan. Real estate development followed and closely tracked the creation of the subway system, so you could find housing for working class people in northern Manhattan. This is a scene in Washington Heights where my grandparents lived, where the housing was newer and much healthier than what they had been living in Lower Manhattan. As the system grew through the 1930s, there were even middle class and upper middle class areas that opened near the subway. Immigrants and the children of immigrants who rode the city through the subway found a way to become at home in America. They found ways to establish ethnic enclaves where they could live with their fellow kinsmen and become Americans more on their own terms. At the same time, they found work in the new subway system. This woman is a conductor on the IRT, probably in the years of World War I, when women went into service to work in subways and other industries because men were away in the war effort. My grandfather was the son of German immigrants, and he worked on the subway as well. But the job of working on the subway system was very, very hard. all the way through into the 1930s. My grandfather worked 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. No holidays, no time off, no benefits. My mother used to tiptoe around the apartment because he worked a night shift and he slept during the day. The job was very, very hard and it was very, very exploitative. One man helped to fix that. Mike Quill, an Irish immigrant who also worked on the subway. Quill had been a veteran of the IRA in the 1920s, and he came to New York City and went to work with other radicals, including Jewish communists, to set the subway system right for its workers. In the 1930s, Local 100 of the Transport Workers Union started representing subway workers and took men like my grandfather out of the hellholes that they'd worked in for many, many years. The subway system grew, transit work became a better job, and the city's population grew, and subway ridership grew all the way through the 1940s. Things looked great, but in the post-war years, something happened. The older immigrants and their children who'd settled into New York City began to leave the city in the years after the World War II. In the 1940s and into the 1950s, taking advantage of federally discriminatory loan policies, federally funded highways, and discriminatory suburban housing policies, white New Yorkers, the children of immigrants often, moved into the suburbs and found better lives a little bit closer to nature than what they had known in New York City. Coming fast behind them were a new generation of New Yorkers, African Americans up from the South, Puerto Ricans up from the island. They too sought better lives in New York. They too sought to ride the subway to better lives in the city, but it was not to be. In the 30 years after the end of World War II, New York City declined dramatically, mostly because its economic base as a seaport and a center of industry was utterly transformed. The jobs that the newcomers wanted were vanishing almost daily. At the same time, crime rose. The federal government changed policies and was less likely to give or lend money to the city to help fund its social programs. By the 1970s, New York City was in trouble. It was on the edge of bankruptcy. There was a blackout that scared people because it was accompanied by a lot of looting, and the city did not seem to have a good future. As usual, the state of the city was reflected in its subways. Subways ran less effectively, they broke down more, and in an unforgettable symbol of the time, many people started to mark the subways with graffiti. Whether it was art and a cry for recognition or vandalism, New Yorkers debated bitterly. But there's no getting around the fact that by the late 1970s, most New Yorkers did not think that their city or its subway system had a good future. In fact, in the 1970s, for the only time in the 20th century, the city of New York lost population. That's the sign of how little people thought of its future. But by the 1980s, the beginnings of a solution were at hand. A businessman named Richard Ravitch, who had a great public spirit, along with leaders in the transit sector, put together a plan to fix the subways, repair the tracks, clean up the graffiti, and put everything on a properly funded basis. It took a while, but by the 1990s, subway service in New York City had dramatically improved. The second improvement to the city came from a somewhat unexpected source. In 1965, Lyndon Johnson went to the base of the Statue of Liberty and signed legislation that opened up immigration to the United States of America. His plan ditched the old discriminatory quota system and admitted people from all around the world. New immigrants came to New York City from the Caribbean, from Latin America, from Africa, from Asia. They brought new life to the city, and they energized neighborhoods that seemed like they were on the brink of despair. They also became transit workers. West Indians became as common in the transit system as Irish Americans had been in the 1920s. Indeed, the majority of transit workers by the 1990s were people of color, African Americans, Latinos, and Asians. Once again, immigrant labor and migrant labor was restoring the city of New York. With a healthy transit system, neighborhoods blossomed again. Washington Heights became the center of a small Russian Jewish community. Dominicans came to New York and became the largest immigrant community of the time. Flushing became a big Chinatown and the home of many Asian immigrants, beginning to eclipse the historic Chinatown in Lower Manhattan. Things looked good. New Yorkers, as late as 2000, thought they were riding the subway to a better future, but there were going to be two problems that they did not entirely oversee. One of those problems was the arrival of many more people in New York City. Affluent people decided that New York, with crime down and prosperity up, was a good place to live. New housing went up, and in old neighborhoods, people moved into businesses and dwellings that older residents had inhabited for years. Rents went up, and businesses closed when people couldn't afford to pay the new cost of doing business in New York City. The appearance of certain kind of businesses in your neighborhood could frighten folks and make them think that they were about to be priced out of a neighborhood where they had lived for years. Some folks got resentful, angry even, wanted to defend their neighborhoods. Others, particularly African Americans and Latinos, moved deeper into the city, sometimes further out on existing subway lines, but sometimes a further distance from subway lines. The combination was terrible because it left them with longer commutes to work in downtown Manhattan, downtown Brooklyn, or downtown Queens. This was bad enough, but it got even worse in the early years of the 21st century. A succession of governors and mayors underfunded the transit system. They took money raised for subways and spent it on things like state-owned ski resorts in the Catskills and Adirondacks. They deferred payments on much-needed repairs and instead borrowed money, but then wound up paying debt service. And worst of all, they stopped maintaining the tracks and the signal system that are the nerve center of the subway system. That meant more delays, longer commutes, more breakdowns, more headaches for the average New Yorker trying to get to work. In recent years, the decline in subway service was so bad that fewer people started riding the subway, even though the city's population continues to grow. Who's to blame? There's a lot of blame to go around. Governors and mayors, going back to the time of Rudy Giuliani, in fact. My friend Gene Rushinoff, who's an expert on the transit system in New York City and has worked to do a lot to improve it, thinks Mayor de Blasio gets about 30% of the blame, but that Governor Cuomo gets about 70% of the blame. But they need to do a lot of work right now to get the subway system on track. Thankfully, there is energetic leadership at the top of the transit system, and people are talking about new kinds of taxes in the form of congestion pricing, new kinds of taxes that would require real estate interests that benefit from the presence of the subway to pay a more fair share of running the system. People are also talking about safeguarding the funding of the subway system so that money raised for subways is used for subways and doesn't get diverted to extraneous projects. The system right now is at a crossroads. It's poised between its past successes and its current problems, but it needs to be fixed and it needs to be repaired. If we're going to keep faith with the labor of generations of immigrants, past and present, who built and operated the New York City subway. If we're going to have a good future in New York City, we need a good subway system. Together, we can ride the subway to a better future if we get the funding and operations of the New York City subway right. Thank you.